Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it is your first time here. My name is Jess. Today's video is going to be my March reading wrap up, and I am a little bit late with this because unfortunately I caught COVID at the tail end of March and I didn't quite bounce back in the way that I expected to. So I've been out of action for a couple of weeks, but now I'm here to talk about all the books that I read, and I read quite a few in the month of March. Honestly, I'm not having as great a reading experience in April, but without further ado, let's jump in and start talking about the books. So as always, I'm going to talk about them in the order that I read them. First up, we have Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. I feel like all I do at the moment is talk about Robin Hobb's books. I'm either adding them to TBRs or I'm talking about them in wrap-ups, so I will try and keep this as brief as possible. These are adult high fantasy set in a world called the Realm of the Elderlings. There are several books in several trilogies, and this is book one of the Live Ship Traders. So we are following numerous characters, but predominantly we have Captain Kennet, a pirate with high aspirations. We have a highborn young woman called Althea, whose situation changes drastically when her father dies and her inheritance passes to her sister and her brother-in-law. And then we have Althea's nephew Wintro, who is in training to be a priest until he is forced on board a ship and actually ends up enslaved. There is a rich magical system in this world based around the idea of boats or ships coming to life based on the material that they are made out of, which sounds like it could be quite silly, but actually this book is very dark in places. As with all of Robin Hobb's books, this is predominantly about our characters and about the overall world and scene that she is setting, although as readers we don't know that necessarily at this point. This was a reread for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I particularly like the character of Captain Kennet, who is very morally grey and so a favourite of mine. Yeah, I gave this one 4 stars. I would highly recommend. Next up we have The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. This is historical fiction. I think it's what you would refer to as Gothic Victorian, and when I picked this up, when I read the back, initially I was extremely excited because it really reminded me of The Corset by Laura Purcell, which is a book that I read and raved and recommend all of the time. And definitely when I started reading it, it was giving me all the same vibes when we meet our main character Franny and we can immediately tell that something is a little bit off. Then this book went in a different direction and never really came back again. So we meet our main character Franny when she has been imprisoned, accused of murdering her master and mistress, and certainly it seems like that is the case until Franny starts to tell her own story. So Franny started as a slave on a plantation in Jamaica. She is brought to London by her master and given as a gift to Mr. and Mrs. Benham, and then ends up being Mrs. Benham's lady's maid. Mr. and Mrs. Benham being the couple who are then found murdered. This had the potential to be such a dark story, but I feel like it didn't quite know what it wanted to do, and so as a result it didn't really explore one particular topic or one character fully. So for me, my reading experience of this just felt a little bit flat, and that might be down to me and my expectations of the book. I don't know, I felt like it could have been incredibly intense and incredibly atmospheric. Certainly we get hints of it, we're teased with it. Franny's master in Jamaica is an extremely twisted individual, and we are shown that maybe Franny also has that side to her personality. I feel like we were teased with it and then we were given a really sanitized version of what happened, and as a result, as I say, it just made it all feel a little bit flat for me, which might be down to me and my expectations. It might be a me thing rather than the book thing. There were things that this book did well. I enjoyed its exploration of the class system, particularly from Franny's point of view, so how she feels incredibly trapped and frustrated by a system that essentially works against her, how bleak and how hopeless that situation is, and how even when it feels like there's a glimmer of a chance that something might change for her, ultimately that is not going to be the case. And I also thought that there was some beautiful writing in here as well. The prose in parts was beautiful, but it just missed the mark for me. There was just something that was a little bit off. I liked it, but I didn't love it, and as a result I only gave it 3 stars. Next up we have A Place for Us, which was my book club's pick for the month of March. This is contemporary fiction and I have mixed feelings about it. Usually I am a fan of quiet books in which not a lot happens, and that is definitely what this book is. And I also thought that the writing was absolutely beautiful. You can see that I have tabbed several quotes which I wanted to go back and reflect on and which really resonated with me. So on paper it seems like it would be a book that I would really enjoy. We have an Indian American Muslim family who have gathered together for the wedding of the eldest daughter, and straight away we are given to know that there is some anxiety over the son in the family, Amar, who has been absent for several years, and we get the perspective of each member of the family and how they feel about that. And then we go backwards and forwards in time, almost like little vignettes of the family's life, as we begin to discover what it was that led to Amar leaving the family and how that has had an impact. And then we have obviously the more present day timeline of the wedding and what is happening there as well. I thought that aside from the beautiful writing, there were also some really good themes explored in the book. There is a strong cultural and religious difference between parent and child. We have 3 children growing up in a Western culture, and they have got to learn how to navigate their home life, which is with it where the parents have very traditional Indian Muslim views, and then the culture of their school life and just the outside world, and how each child chooses to navigate that, how each child chooses to respond to that, and therefore the impact that has and the relationship that each child then has with their parents and how their parents respond to it, and all of that I thought was explored really well. But I found the abrupt timeline changes to be quite jarring and messy. You can literally jump forwards 10 years or back 5 years in the space of a paragraph, and it was quite confusing to keep up with and to think, oh okay, now we're here and how does that fit with our overall timeline. It just felt really choppy and all over the place, and I found that that created a disconnect for me with the characters and with the overall story. And it seems like that was the general gist of what people thought in the book club as well, that it's beautifully told and it explores some really good themes, but it was quite a jarring reading experience, and that distance that was then connected meant that it felt a little bit boring at times to read. The last part of the book, Part 4, is actually written from the first person perspective of the father, and for me that was the most insightful and the most interesting, and I almost wish that the rest of the book had been told in that style. If the author had picked each of the main characters and given us the perspectives of each of the characters, I think that that would have been more cohesive and definitely given that more rounded character connection between the book and then me as a reader. So yeah, mixed feelings. As I say, for me the overall story is a 2.5 star. I really didn't enjoy it at all, but I've bumped it up to a 3.5 star because of the writing style, and I would definitely be interested in reading more from this author. The writing I thought was exquisite, cannot fault the writing. I just wish there had been the content to then back it up. Next we have A Sky Beyond the Storm by Sabaa Tahir. This is the final book in the Ember Quartet, which again is a book I feel like I've talked about a lot on the channel, or a series I've talked about a lot on the channel. It's YA fantasy. I can't obviously talk too much about this book without giving any major spoilers away, so I will just say that it was a very satisfying, if brutal, conclusion to the series. Do I think that this could have been a trilogy? Yes. What happens in this book is satisfying and it makes sense and it fits with what we have been building to, and it is fairly explosive in terms of everything else that has gone on before, but I do feel like it dragged a little bit, and there was things in this book that we could have dealt with many books ago, and it could have been a trilogy and it would have been more impactful and concise as a trilogy. It wasn't my favourite. I did enjoy it. The reason that the reason that I'm not quite as satisfied with this is because it features one of my big bugbears, which is when an author latches on to a particular phrase and they repeat it again and again and again. And in this particular book, it was an ember in the ashes. Everybody was an ember in the ashes, and once I noticed it, I then kept on noticing it, and it just became a real bee in my bonnet. So yeah, I gave it 4 stars. As I say, I can't really talk about it much other than to say it's a Roman inspired, brutal, dark YA fantasy with rich characters, rich magic system, really entertaining, really readable. Even if you're not familiar with fantasy, I feel like this is a series that you could pick up and engage with. But obviously I can't explain what happened without spoiling it, so I will not. And then we have the 4 books that I read for my first video in my Smash the TBR series, which was books with bird in the title. I talk a lot about those books in that video, so I'm going to try and be really concise here. If you would like to see my full reading experience of the books, then I will leave a link to that video in the description bar down below. But as I say, I'm going to try and be concise with these books. So first up, I read The Gravity of Birds by Tracy Guzman. This is a multi-timeline family drama. We have an artist and 2 sisters who meet one summer at a holiday lake house, and we immediately know that something happens between them all. And then we flash forward several decades, and our artist is now very famous, and he reveals to someone who has documented his life and his works that there is a painting he never told them about, and that there is a panel missing from that painting. The painting just so happens to be of the 2 sisters. As a result, we have this gentleman who has documented the painter's life and an expert who go off in search of this missing panel for the painting, and we begin to find out through their journey. We flip-flop back and forth through time what it was that went on between our 2 sisters and the painter, and ultimately what the result of that was. I enjoyed this more than I thought that I would. I particularly liked the time we spent with the expert and the person who documented the painter's life. I thought that they were really chaotic characters, but they provided some light entertainment in what otherwise was quite a heavy family drama. The thing that let this book down for me was the thing that happened, the big reveal. It was kind of like anticlimactic, sort of, oh, is that it? I mean, it does a good job of exploring human nature, looking at compassion, forgiveness, the results of the decisions that we make, how as people we can make all kinds of decisions from places of hurt, love, betrayal, you name it. On the spectrum of human emotions, you know, we make all kinds of decisions, and sometimes we don't come back from those, and it does a very good job of looking at that. And I also thought that its exploration of the world of art was quite interesting. It's not something that I'm massively familiar with, but it did feel anticlimactic. It felt like we were building and building and building, and then it was sort of like, okay, is that it? Like, really, is that it? I think if you enjoy Kate Morton's books, you would like this. It felt very much like a Kate Morton, perhaps without some of the depth of character connection that we get from a Kate Morton book. But yeah, on the whole, I enjoyed it. I gave it 3.75 stars. I liked it more than I thought that I would. It's actually the book that I thought I would enjoy the least, and I think it was the one I enjoyed second most, so there you go. Next up, we have The Yellow Bird Sings by Jennifer Rosner. This was a book sent to me by the publisher for review. It is World War II historical fiction set in Poland in the 1940s. We are following a Jewish mother and daughter, Rosa and Shira, who flee their family home and hide in the barn of a neighbour when the rest of their family is captured and murdered by the Nazis. And as you might imagine, they have to remain quiet because they don't want to risk getting caught themselves. And with a young child, that is virtually impossible, and so our mother Rosa has to make the heartbreaking decision to send Shira to hide in an orphanage in a nunnery and basically not know what happens to her daughter, try to stay alive herself, and then just trust that her daughter Shira is safe and well. This is a book that I really appreciated for what it did, but I wish so much that it had gone into more depth with our characters. It had the potential to be a book that would really hook and resonate and emotionally be impactful, and it just stayed very surface level. It was extremely readable and it was very engaging, and I always appreciate books that shine a light on situations or occurrences in history that I might otherwise not have known about, and it does that well, but it almost reads like an essay on the topic. So we skip forwards in time really rapidly and decisions get made instantaneously, and it's almost like this happened and that was sad, this happened and that was frightening, but we're just kind of told it, we're not really shown it. And for me particularly, my emotional connection is a huge part of my reading experience, and I really missed that from this book. I think in my vlog I say I wanted a book that would do emotional damage to me, and I thought that this book was going to be it, and it wasn't, and that kind of pretty much sums up my feelings. So I gave this 3 stars. As I say, I appreciated it for what it did. I think if you like books that are like this and you don't want to have that kind of emotional response to reading, then you'd probably really enjoy this, but for me that was the element that was missing, unfortunately. And then this book, we have The Magpie Society, One for Sorrow. This book gets marked down because, well, for 2 reasons actually. It's dark academia YA based at an illustrious boarding school. The reason that it gets marked down is because we are presented with a mystery in this book, and there is 0 resolution for that mystery by the end. I was aware going into it that there was a second book, but I thought that it would either build on what we had learnt in the first book, or it would present a second mystery to be explored. And actually what we have is the second mystery presented to us at the end of this book, and 0 resolution for the first mystery that we have spent the entirety of this book learning about. And so I feel a little bit duped and a little bit tricked into having to read the second book. The second thing that annoyed me was the blatant stereotyping that happens in this book. So we have our uptight British pupil Ivy, and then we have our laid back American pupil Audrey. And I know that stereotyping exists because stereotyping exists, but it just felt really uninventive for the authors to fall into that way of categorising their characters, and it just bugged me and I was feeling petty, so it got marked down. As I say, this is dark academia YA. We know right away that something has happened. There just is something that feels off. We have Audrey, who has moved to this school to escape something in her past, and we have high achieving Ivy, who is still reeling from the apparent suicide of a pupil the summer term before. And right at the beginning of term, a podcast is released called I Know Who Killed Lola, and one of you is next. And so we are basically seeing the fallout of that. Audrey and Ivy don't like each other to begin with. They're forced to room together, they don't like each other, but they are thrown together and they have to kind of uncover what it is that's going on, and as readers we follow along with them, except that you don't get to find out what is going on. Actually, that's not true. There are 2 mysteries in this book. There is the overall mystery, and then there is the mystery of who it is that's behind the podcast, but you literally know who it is that's behind the podcast by about here because it's glaringly obvious. So that was another thing which was quite anticlimactic. I gave this 3 stars. I don't know whether I feel inclined to pick up the second one. It was entertaining, it was readable. I feel like I'm bashing on this book quite a lot. I enjoyed the setting, I thought that it was very atmospheric, I liked the concept of the whole thing. I just don't like that you don't get to find out any of the answers to the thing that you have been exploring all the way through this book. It's like you have to read the second book to find that out, and why not just make it one really big book then? I gave it 3 stars. And the final book that I'm going to talk about is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. This is World War I historical fiction and was my favourite of the 4 books that I read, bar the first part. So we start the book in 1910. We are following a young Englishman called Stephen who moves to Amiens and stays with a family as part of something to do with his work. And right away we know that Stephen is going to end up having an affair with the wife of the family. And for the rest of the book, that is kind of a theme, like the impact of the decisions that Stephen made whilst he was there, how that influences and impacts what happens to him going forwards. If you watched my vlog, you will know that I was not enamoured with that part of the storyline. Let me see if I can find where part 2 begins. Had I not carried on reading and got to part 2, I would have really disliked the book. I didn't like anything about that part of the book. So that is how long part 1 is. That is Stephen in Amiens with this family making poor decisions, and then we go into the World War I section, which I just loved. But had I based my reading experience on this section, I would not have finished the book. It is far too long. It could easily have been like a chapter. The impact of what happens is not so significant that it couldn't have been explained to us in a much more concise way. And actually, once we got into the World War sections, I was just completely moved. I thought that it was so raw and so visceral. I cried at several parts. It was fantastically explored, and I would highly recommend it for that section alone. I have read many World War historical fiction books, but not really any where we get to experience what the men on the front experienced. I think the author did a really great job of looking at that, and it was quite brutal and unforgiving as well, in that we met characters who then went on to die, which I think is probably quite an accurate representation of what life was like at that time as well. Yeah, I have big feelings about this about this section. I just don't think that it was necessary. Although it sets the scene and there is a thread that then follows throughout, it just didn't need to be as long as it was. But I gave it 4 stars. I thought that the latter half of the book was, yeah, just incredible. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend. So there you go. They are all the books that I read in the month of March. Do let me know what your favourite read in the month was. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I've talked about and what you thought about them. I always love to know. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you are keeping safe and well. Take care, and I'll see you soon.